Before the sun rises over the mountains of Tigray, tens of thousands of Ethiopian soldiers are already awake, positioned across ridgelines they know intimately. While several miles away, an Italian general studies his maps and believes he is about to secure a colonial victory that will elevate Italy into the ranks of Europe's imperial powers. And by nightfall, that assumption will be shattered. An entire expeditionary force broken, and the balance of colonial ambition in Africa violently disrupted. Stay with this story, because by the end, you will understand why the Battle of Adwa was not a lucky reversal, not a symbolic fluke, but one of the most strategically executed military victories of the 19th century. To grasp what happened on March 1st, 1896. You have to begin with the atmosphere of the age. The late 19th century was defined by European expansion into Africa, formalized at the Berlin Conference, and accelerated by competition among empires eager to claim territory before their rivals did. Britain secured Egypt and Sudan. France pushed west and central. Germany staked its claims. Italy, newly unified and still seeking international stature, wanted proof that it too could dominate overseas. It established control along the Red Sea coast in Eritrea. But a narrow strip of coastline was not the empire Rome envisioned. Prestige required inland conquest. Ethiopia stood in the way. Unlike much of the continent at the time, Ethiopia was not a loose patchwork waiting to be partitioned. It was an empire under Emperor Menelik II, who had consolidated authority through political alliances, strategic marriages, and calculated diplomacy. He understood European ambition clearly. He had seen what had happened to other African states. He also understood that survival in this new era required adaptation. In 1889, Menelik signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Italy. The treaty, on the surface, recognized mutual interests and friendship, but a critical clause diverged between versions. The Italian text implied that Ethiopia would conduct foreign relations through Italy, effectively making it an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version framed that arrangement as optional. Italy presented the treaty to European powers as proof that Ethiopia had accepted subordinate status. Menelik rejected that interpretation and formally repudiated the protectorate claim. That diplomatic fracture did not immediately erupt into battle. Instead, it triggered preparation. Over the next several years, Menelik pursued arms procurement aggressively. Ethiopia purchased modern rifles and artillery from European suppliers, including French and Russian channels. These acquisitions were not symbolic. They were substantial. By the mid-1890s, Ethiopia possessed tens of thousands of modern firearms. At the same time, Menelik mobilized regional rulers across the empire: Amhara, Tigray, Oromo, and others, forging an unprecedented military coalition. Empress Taytu Betul played a critical political role, reinforcing unity and supporting strategic decisions that would prove decisive. Italy misjudged both the scale and cohesion of this mobilization. General Oreste Baratieri commanded the Italian Expeditionary Force. His troops included Italian regulars and Eritrean askari units. Rome pressured him to act decisively, to secure victory before domestic critics questioned the campaign's cost. Yet the terrain was harsh, supply lines stretched, and intelligence incomplete. Ethiopian forces were not scattered bands. They were concentrated in numbers that far exceeded Italian estimates. On the night before the battle, Italian forces advanced in separate columns toward what they believed were advantageous positions near the town of Adwa. The movement was complex, relying on maps that proved unreliable in mountainous terrain. Coordination faltered. Units became separated in darkness across uneven highland ridges. When the sun rose on March 1st, the Italian army did not confront a fragmented enemy. It confronted an organized mass positioned across elevated ground. Ethiopian forces exploited the terrain effectively, using numerical superiority and modern rifles to overwhelm isolated Italian columns before they could reinforce one another. Artillery positions were overrun. Defensive formations collapsed under sustained pressure. The technological advantage Italy assumed would guarantee victory dissolved in the face of preparation and coordination. Casualties mounted rapidly. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed or captured. Equipment fell into Ethiopian hands. The retreat became disorderly. The scale of defeat was unmistakable. Within months, the Treaty of Addis Ababa formally recognized Ethiopian independence and nullified Italy's protectorate claim. In Rome, political fallout led to government crisis. Across Europe, the outcome disrupted assumptions about inevitable colonial dominance. Ethiopia had not merely resisted, it had won decisively in conventional battle. The consequences extended beyond immediate diplomacy. Adwa became a symbol in later Pan-African thought, referenced as evidence that European expansion was not invincible. Yet its significance rests not only in symbolism, but in strategy. Menelik's victory emerged from diplomatic awareness, arms acquisition, coalition building, terrain advantage, and the exploitation of Italian overextension. The battle at Adwa did not halt European colonization across Africa, but it forced recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty at the height of imperial expansion. It demonstrated that state-level organization, when aligned with modern military preparation, could overturn imperial assumptions. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, the scramble for Africa encountered a limit, and that limit reshaped the political map of the continent. Italy did not march into Ethiopia with cannons alone. It marched in with paperwork, and in many ways the war began not on a mountain ridge, but inside a paragraph. In 1889, ink dried on the Treaty of Wuchale, and for a brief moment, it appeared that diplomacy had secured peace between the Kingdom of Italy and the Ethiopian Empire. But buried within the text was a fracture that would widen into war. Stay with this story, because by the end you will see how a single disputed sentence forced two empires onto a collision course that neither could step back from. The treaty was signed shortly after Menelik II consolidated power as Emperor of Ethiopia. Italy, eager to expand its influence inland from Eritrea, sought formal recognition and advantage. The agreement promised friendship, trade, and recognition of territorial boundaries. But Article 17 carried two meanings. In the Italian version, Ethiopia agreed to conduct all foreign affairs through Italy. That language effectively made Ethiopia a protectorate, subordinate in diplomacy, controlled in its international voice. In the Amharic version, the clause read differently. It stated that Ethiopia may use Italy's assistance in foreign affairs if it so chose. Optional, not mandatory. That difference was not minor. It was sovereignty itself. Italy presented its version to European powers as confirmation that Ethiopia had entered its imperial sphere. In the language of the Scramble for Africa, that meant other European states were expected to respect Italy's claim. Menelik, upon realizing how the treaty was being interpreted abroad, rejected the protectorate status outright. He sent diplomatic communications directly to other European powers, asserting Ethiopia's independence and exposing the discrepancy. This was not an emotional outburst. It was calculated resistance. Menelik understood that recognition mattered in the European diplomatic system. If Italy's claim went uncontested, Ethiopia's position would weaken internationally before a single shot was fired. By repudiating the protectorate clause, he forced clarity. Either Italy would accept Ethiopia as a sovereign equal, or it would attempt to impose control by force. Rome chose force. Yet the decision was not driven purely by arrogance. Italy was under internal pressure. It was a young nation competing with older empires for prestige. Colonial success was seen as validation of national strength. A protectorate in Ethiopia would elevate Italy's status. Losing face would damage it. The diplomatic breakdown escalated gradually. Italy increased military presence in Eritrea. Ethiopia continued mobilization internally. Each side interpreted the other's movement as confirmation of inevitable confrontation. What makes this phase critical is that Ethiopia was not reacting blindly. Menelik used the breathing space between treaty dispute and open war to accelerate arms acquisition. He purchased modern rifles in large quantities. He ensured that regional rulers were bound not only by loyalty, but by shared interest in resisting foreign domination. The dispute over Article 17 did not catch Ethiopia unprepared. It sharpened its focus. Italy, meanwhile, assumed that technological superiority and European military discipline would compensate for any delay. It believed that even if Ethiopia rejected protectorate status diplomatically, it could be compelled militarily. But diplomacy had already reshaped the battlefield before the armies ever assembled. By the time Italian forces advanced inland in 1895, this was no longer a misunderstanding over translation. It was a confrontation over sovereignty, recognition, and imperial hierarchy. The treaty had revealed Italy's ambition and Ethiopia's refusal. There was no neutral ground left. And in that narrowing space between diplomacy and war, both sides prepared. One convinced it was enforcing imperial order, the other determined to defend independence at any cost. The mountains would decide which interpretation of that treaty would survive. By the time the first Italian units pushed deeper into the Ethiopian highlands, the outcome of the war was no longer going to depend on bravery alone. It was going to depend on preparation. And in that arena, Emperor Menelik II had already been working for years. What makes Adwa extraordinary is not simply what happened on the battlefield, but how deliberately Ethiopia shaped the battlefield long before March 1st, 1896 ever arrived. Menelik understood something many European commanders underestimated. Modern warfare in the late 19th century was not won by tradition, but by logistics. So he adapted. Throughout the early 1890s, Ethiopia imported tens of thousands of modern rifles from European arms markets. These were not symbolic purchases. They were significant acquisitions that transformed the firepower of the imperial army. French dealers, Russian connections, and even indirect Italian channels supplied weapons that would later be turned against Italy itself. Ethiopia was not isolated from global commerce. It used global commerce strategically, but rifles alone do not win wars. Unity does. Ethiopia was not a homogeneous state. It was an empire composed of diverse regions and leaders, each with its own interests and authority. In moments of weakness, that diversity could fragment. In moments of strength, it could concentrate. Menelik's achievement was political as much as military. He mobilized regional rulers across the empire under a shared cause, defense of sovereignty. Leaders from Amhara, Tigray, Oromo territories, and beyond brought their forces to the imperial banner. Empress Taytu Betul played a decisive role in consolidating support, influencing strategy, and reinforcing resolve among the elite. The numbers alone were staggering. Estimates suggest Ethiopia assembled between 70,000 and 100,000 fighters. That scale shocked European observers, who often assumed African armies would lack coordination or discipline. Instead, Italy encountered a force that was vast, motivated, and increasingly equipped with modern firearms. Italy, meanwhile, faced internal tension. General Oreste Baratieri commanded the expeditionary force stationed in Eritrea. He was cautious by instinct, aware of the risks of advancing into mountainous terrain against a numerically superior enemy. But Rome demanded action. Political leaders in Italy wanted victory. Swift, decisive, symbolic. Delay appeared as weakness. Supply lines stretched thin as Italian forces moved inland. The terrain of northern Ethiopia was not forgiving. Narrow ridges, steep elevations, limited water sources. Every advance required calculation. Ethiopian forces, familiar with the landscape, did not rush recklessly. They shadowed movements. They gathered intelligence. They positioned themselves deliberately. The contrast sharpened as months passed. Italy assumed its professional army would break Ethiopian resistance through discipline and artillery. Ethiopia focused on concentration and terrain advantage. One side leaned on precedent, the other prepared for disruption. By early 1896, pressure intensified. Italian forces faced logistical strain and uncertainty about Ethiopian positions. Ethiopian armies remained concentrated near the town of Adwa, occupying high ground that overlooked potential Italian approaches. The geography mattered. Whoever controlled the ridgelines controlled visibility, movement, and timing. And then came the critical decision. Under pressure from Rome, Baratieri chose to advance. On the night of February 29, 1896, Italian forces moved in separate columns toward what commanders believed were strategic positions. The plan depended on coordination and precise navigation in darkness across mountainous terrain. It depended on assumptions about Ethiopian deployment that would soon prove dangerously incomplete. Ethiopian forces were not dispersed. They were ready. As dawn approached on March 1st, Italian units found themselves more isolated than expected, stretched across ridges without full support from adjacent columns. Ethiopian commanders seized the opportunity. Concentrated forces began pressing isolated Italian positions before reinforcement could arrive. The preparation that had unfolded quietly for years now converged into a single moment. Menelik's strategy had never been to defend passively. It had been to assemble overwhelming force, exploit terrain, and allow Italian overextension to create its own vulnerability. The mountains were no longer neutral landscape. They had become instruments. And as the sun rose fully over Adwa, the decisive test of that preparation began. When the first volleys echoed across the ridgelines of Adwa at dawn on March 1st, 1896, the battle did not unfold as Italy had imagined in Rome. Italian officers expected engagement with a divided enemy that could be pushed back in stages. Instead, they found themselves confronting waves of Ethiopian forces converging from multiple elevations, moving with urgency and cohesion across terrain they understood far better than the invaders below them. The Italian plan had depended on synchronization. 3 columns advancing under cover of darkness were meant to occupy key high ground before Ethiopian forces could react. But distances in the highlands proved deceptive. Communication between columns faltered. Units that believed support was nearby discovered instead that they were exposed. Ethiopian commanders moved quickly once the Italian positions became clear. Forces under regional leaders pressed isolated columns before reinforcement could arrive. Modern rifles, acquired over years of preparation, matched Italian firepower more closely than European observers had anticipated. Artillery exchanges erupted across ridges, but Ethiopian numerical superiority amplified pressure where Italian lines thinned. The terrain shaped every movement. Narrow mountain passes restricted maneuverability. Elevation exposed Italian formations to fire from above. Once engagement intensified, retreat routes narrowed into bottlenecks. What had begun as a calculated advance shifted rapidly into defensive survival. General Baratieri struggled to re-establish coordination. Orders transmitted through fragmented lines could not restore cohesion quickly enough. Ethiopian forces concentrated repeatedly against separated Italian units, preventing regrouping. Momentum shifted decisively by midday. Casualties mounted heavily among Italian ranks. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were captured. Artillery pieces and rifles fell into Ethiopian hands. Eritrean Askari units, caught between imperial command and battlefield collapse, suffered deeply as well. By late afternoon, organized resistance deteriorated into retreat. The scale of the defeat was unmistakable. This was not a tactical setback to be reinterpreted as partial success. It was a decisive battlefield loss against a force European strategists had underestimated. As surviving Italian troops withdrew toward Eritrea, news of the outcome began traveling across continents. In Rome, political shock translated quickly into crisis. The government faced intense public outrage. Italy's imperial ambition, meant to demonstrate strength, had resulted instead in humiliation. In Ethiopia, the victory secured immediate leverage. The subsequent Treaty of Addis Ababa formally recognized Ethiopian independence and nullified the protectorate claim embedded in the disputed Treaty of Wuchale. Sovereignty was not merely defended militarily. It was affirmed diplomatically, but the implications extended further than treaty clauses. Adwa disrupted assumptions embedded within the scramble for Africa. It demonstrated that a centralized African empire, equipped with modern arms and strategic coordination, could defeat a European army in open battle. It challenged the inevitability narrative that had accompanied colonial expansion. Yet the victory did not end imperial ambition globally. It did not halt colonization across the continent. What it did was create a boundary, a clear demonstration that expansion could fail when met with preparation, unity, and strategic execution. The ridges of Adwa became more than terrain. They became reference, and the consequences of that reference would echo far beyond 1896. In the weeks after the battle, as the wounded were counted and the captured marched under guard, the consequences of Adwa began unfolding far beyond the Ethiopian highlands. In Rome, the defeat triggered political collapse. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi's government fell under the weight of public outrage. Italy, which had entered the campaign seeking imperial prestige, found itself confronting humiliation on the international stage. Newspapers across Europe reported the scale of the loss with a mixture of disbelief and recalibration. The assumption that colonial expansion was an unstoppable march of European superiority had been visibly interrupted. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed later in 1896, formally annulled the disputed protectorate clause of the Treaty of Wuchale and recognized Ethiopia as a sovereign state. This recognition mattered profoundly. At a time when most of Africa was being absorbed into European empires, Ethiopia's independence was codified diplomatically in a system dominated by those same empires. The victory was not symbolic rhetoric. It was translated into international legitimacy. For Ethiopia, Adwa solidified Menelik II's authority internally and externally. It strengthened the empire's standing among global powers and reinforced the political cohesion that had been mobilized for war. The victory demonstrated that sovereignty was not merely declared. It could be defended and preserved against modern military force. Beyond Ethiopia's borders, the impact was ideological. In the decades that followed, Adwa was invoked in emerging Pan-African thought as proof that colonial dominance was not absolute. Intellectuals and activists in the African diaspora referenced the battle as an example of organized resistance succeeding against imperial expansion. It did not reverse colonization across the continent, but it provided a counter-narrative to inevitability. The long-term geopolitical consequences were equally complex. Italy would return in 1935 under Benito Mussolini, seeking to avenge the earlier defeat in what became the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. That later invasion temporarily disrupted Ethiopian independence, but the memory of Adwa remained central to national identity and resistance. Even in occupation, the precedent of 1896 carried weight. Today, Adwa occupies a distinct place in both Ethiopian history and broader discussions of anti-colonial resistance. It is commemorated annually in Ethiopia, not as myth, but as documented military achievement. Military historians continue to analyze the campaign as a case study in strategic mobilization, coalition building, terrain exploitation, and the dangers of overextension driven by political pressure. What ultimately defines Adwa is not that it was the only African victory against European forces, but that it occurred at a moment when the colonial partition of Africa seemed nearly complete. It disrupted momentum at a critical juncture. It forced European powers to acknowledge limits. On March 1st, 1896, in the mountains near the town of Adwa, sovereignty was not negotiated, it was enforced. And in doing so, Ethiopia altered the trajectory of its own history and reshaped the psychology of empire at the height of its confidence.